So I want to look at what we could do practically using human rights law research. Law is supportive of residents and overstretched staff working in residential care homes. And I'm going to do this not in an abstract way, but one which includes constructive recommendations which you can work with. We think of human rights as a sword and as an accuser, but it can also be used to prevent abuses. This is very different from the ways we see human rights reported in the media. And what I'm recommending from my research is constructive and miles away from party politics and the fear that sometimes, unfortunately, surrounds human rights. I'm also going to focus, for the most part, on how human rights law research can be used in ways which are not expensive to use, because we know about the financial restraints. I've called my research Making the Invisible Visible, because residents living in care homes are generally invisible. They're invisible because they lead lives which are rarely seen except by close friends, family, and staff. So we need to think of new constructive ways of using all tools, including international human rights law, to raise the profile of care home residents in the public's mind. And we need to do this because governments of all political persuasions have not recognised the urgency of the reforms needed to social care, because in part there is this lack of visibility. Now, an example of this invisibility is a lack of knowledge that over 40% of almost half of those residents in care homes are excluded from the protection of the most important human rights law in the UK, the Human Rights Act. This is because Section 73 of the Care Homes Act says that care homes do perform a public function and do fall within the Human Rights Act, and here's the catch, but only for those who are funded or partially funded by public or local authorities. Now, it's often assumed that this means privately funded residents are without the protection of their human rights. But my research shows that they do have protection under the Human Rights Act and under international human rights law treaties, which are binding on the United Kingdom government, and which means that governments actually are legally obligated to make the resources progressively available to implement these reforms. We tend to think of international law as being distant, perhaps ineffective, and not for organisations and care homes, and not for their residents. But this isn't the case. I've spent my entire professional working life to show that these international human rights treaties are for us all, are easy to use, and are, in the most part, free. So what does this mean? We know the majority of people in residential care homes are women, and there are also younger women who are overlooked. Articles 1, 2, and 3 of the United Nations Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women provides that there ought to be equality between men and women, and a convention is another word for treaty or binding international law. Now, if we have, or we need to collect the data, which shows that the majority of people in residential care are paying for private care are women, then it would be a breach and a violation of the UN Women's Convention. It would be illegal to exclude privately funded women from human rights care and protection. Now, the Women's Convention also states that all countries must take all appropriate measures to eliminate discrimination against women in the field of health care. This is not optional. There's a general rule when it comes to international law, one which is common sense. You must, before using international law, use any effective national remedy in court. But in England, we do not have a right to health care for anyone. Surprising and rather sadly, it's not in the Human Rights Act, despite some of us arguing it should be. As the right is not protected in English law, privately paying women residents are not protected by English law. This means they can directly petition the Women's Committee that oversees the Women's UN Convention. And they don't have to go through expensive court procedures in England because there's simply no remedy available. And the actual procedure under the optional protocol is free. And there is no catches to it being free. This would be a constructive way for privately paying women residents to change the law, not only in relation to the women who would be doing the petitioning, but for all women who are in residential care without protection. Human rights law as a social service serving the community. The basic principle of human rights is that they belong to everyone and you don't lose them the moment you enter a residential care. Human rights are intersectional. Now, this is an idea that's been misunderstood, but all it means is that we have more than one identity, all of us. For example, part of my identity is that I'm a woman, a proud older person, and I'm a granddaughter of refugees. So human rights law recognises the rich racial, ethnic, cultural and religious identities of all of those in residential care. It recognises that different people can be discriminated against in ways that relate to more than one facet of their identity. Applying an intersectional approach means that human rights law also protects care home residents who may also suffer from mental and physical disabilities. The right to consent is fundamental to all those who live in residential care, but it can be particularly challenging for staff to achieve such consent. And consent is a human right. It's an aspect of the right to freedom of expression, which is protected in the UK by the Human Rights Act. A human rights approach to the right to giving of consent is not binary. It's not you can either consent or you can't. Now, I want to make it very clear that I'm not comparing in any way adult care home residents to children, and I emphasise this. But we can sometimes learn from approaches to consent from other groups who've been assumed not to be able to consent. So, for example, very young children in Great Ormond Street have been able to participate in very complex decisions concerning treatment for leukemia. The staff breaks down the decisions into small parts, and children can participate, maybe not in the entire decision, but in parts of the decision. For people living with different forms of dementia, as we know, this is essential. It gives people some form of control over their own destinies and, importantly, can help reduce the fear. So we need to think about a care home residence approach to freedom of expression and to start applying it. The same applies to the right to privacy, which is also essential and often underestimated in residential care homes. In human rights, there's often a balancing exercise. I'm not pretending it will always be simple or even obvious, but the duty of care which the staff have to apply to residents has to be thought of within the framework of human rights law. Guidances can be developed to help staff reach decisions more easily, and there are guides from the British Institute of Human Rights, but I think we need a bit more now to complement these guides to provide more detail. So if care home residents wish to spend time alone outside in the care home's garden, the balancing exercise could include how the Netherlands creates safe spaces for those who have Alzheimer's to be outside safely, and which does not require an available member of staff having to be free to supervise. Apart from the law, there's also the culture of human rights, which is an inclusive culture and which I would say incorporates compassion, empathy, kindness. There are the deprivation of liberty safeguards under the Mental Capacity Act, called DOLS for short, an acronym which unwittingly, when the acronym is spoken aloud, as I've just done, appears to be making light of something really very important and fundamental. Acronyms can also seem technical and incomprehensible for those who need them. And I think that the use of acronyms can be undesirable and risk undermining the human rights of the vulnerable because those of us who use them risk being desensitized for what are fundamental and sometimes painful decisions. So a human rights culture should mean we should rely less on acronyms, even if it means we have to take more time. And we can learn from other countries' approaches to human rights, including from countries we may not have considered before. I had, as Clements kindly said, had the privilege of working in human rights law in South Africa after the end of apartheid. The highest court in South Africa, the South African Constitutional Court, gave a very helpful judgment on how those who have the expertise and the power should reach decisions on those without that power and without that educational experience. The case also concerned a local authority. And although the vulnerable were the poorest in society, many of whom were illiterate, the court said nevertheless each bore an equal responsibility to resolve the issue in a way which respected the dignity of all those involved. They ruled there needed to be a constructive dialogue. And although the case involved impending homelessness, I think it's a very helpful approach which I think can be applied to residential care homes. Applying what I call a constructive dialogue of equals means recognising that some people living in residential care may not understand all the duties that staff have to follow. So these duties need to be explained in an understandable way. It also means that residential care residents or their representatives need to be open to be discussing all possible solutions as long as they accord with human rights. Making the invisible visible becomes an increasing challenge in a society where social media and information technology, as we've just heard, plays an increasingly major role in the policy formations, including by government. I'm one of a group of people globally who've been calling for a UN Convention on the Rights of Older Persons. I started off in children's rights, but as I got older, people asked me to speak about older persons' rights. I'm not sure what the next stage will be. Like others in this country, I've been feeding into the drafting. One of the provisions we've called for, based on the research by other older persons, is a duty placed on government to teach some technological skills to older persons who wish to learn them. Such a duty is already in international law in one of the poorest regions of the world, Africa. And the African Union Treaty says that people have to, and governments have to, develop programs to ensure that older people who wish to can gain access to digital literacy. And this includes those living in care homes. So if a poorer region can do so, we in the United Kingdom, in the top 10 of wealthiest states still, are quite possible for us to do. One of the advantages of social media is that people, thankfully, are becoming less embarrassed about talking about essential bodily functions shared by us all. When we discuss these, and I speak as a daughter of someone who's died young of bowel cancer, whose father died young of bowel cancer, we can help save lives and improve the quality of lives. Essential for us all, isn't it? Bowel and bladder function. But rarely is it thought of as a human right. Yet we should think of these functions in this way and talk about them more publicly. And actually, belatedly, sanitation has been declared in its broadest form to be a human right by the United Nations. And this means we have to think about what does degrading treatment amount to in human rights law? And what does the right to privacy in care homes mean in human rights? Just to explain, the Human Rights Act prohibits degrading treatment, and this provision in Article 3 has a special status in law. It means that all residents of care homes, whether private or publicly funded, are protected against degrading treatment. And the Human Rights Act also protects against privacy to a lesser extent and family life. Now, one of the reasons we ask for our courts to be more representative of society is that it brings different life experiences to judgments. And there is a decision of the Supreme Court which I think would have been decided differently if there'd been more than one woman on the court. And I should disclose an interest here. I was a member of the Equality and Human Rights Commission at the time of the case. The case is called MacDonald in the Royal Boroughs of Kensington and Chelsea. And it failed because the majority of the Supreme Court found in essence that the legal test for degrading was not met by someone who may have to lie in their feces all night until the carers came to her in the morning. But the dissenting judgment by Lady Hale found there was a difference between the need to be provided with nighttime carers to help get to a lavatory or a commode and the needs of someone who is incontinent and is provided with incontinence pads and sheets. The case went to Strasbourg and the European Court of Human Rights, where the court did find a partial violation. And as a result, but not of degrading, interestingly, the right to privacy. And as a result of the judgment, there have been changes made to the assessment processes. So we have to keep pushing at the boundaries of human rights, because otherwise people in social care suffer and are left without any remedy. It increases the sense of isolation and of being invisible that some care home residents have expressed. And that's one of the reasons I think we need further research on the use of international human rights law treaties in the way we deal with social care. Members of treaty bodies, such as the UN Convention on Persons Living with Disabilities, have experience, either directly or indirectly, of what it is to live with a disability. The UN Disability Convention's goal is that all people who have long-term physical, mental, intellectual, or sensory impairments should be entitled to full and effective participation in society. And there's a specific reference in Article 25 to place a duty on governments to provide those health services needed by persons with disabilities, such as services designed to minimise and prevent further disabilities. This means that care homes should provide sufficient mental stimulation, access to appropriate physical therapy and equipment. And of course, this will be of benefit to everybody living in the care home. And there's also a duty in the Convention on governments to provide health professionals with an awareness of human rights of persons with disabilities and to provide specific training. Now, where such training is not available to staff, obviously it can be raised with the government first. But if the provisions of the Convention on the Rights of Persons Living with Disabilities are not implemented, there's also a free petitioning system, like the Women's Convention. I know that using international human rights treaties may be new to you, but the UK government does not regard it as a hostile act. Such petitions are not regarded as aggressive. Governments see these petitions as helping shape policies and preventing further abuses, which could lead to more serious consequences for governments down the line. Indeed, the UK government will be involved in the drafting of a new treaty, which will have major implications for improving the well-being of residents in social care homes and in all forms of social care. In April this year, the United Nations agreed to establish a working group to draft a United Nations Convention on the Rights of Older Persons, the treaty I mentioned earlier. And the present government and previous governments have been supportive of the United Nations efforts on adopting this treaty. But it will take time. I've helped draft a human rights treaty, and I can tell you it will take time, sometimes up to a decade. But do not conclude that nothing will be done in the interim. To the contrary, whilst the convention is being drafted, the government will seek to raise standards in the areas which our Older Persons Convention will address before the convention comes into being. So we'll be pushing, possibly, at an open door. And having participated at the British Civil Society end of the drafting, I can tell you there will be quite a few provisions on social care and the protection of the human rights of residents and the training of staff. Although we may not realise it, human rights is being placed in the centre of the provision of social care. It's no longer peripheral, and it's not an afterthought. And residential care home organisations now need to be able to participate and to respond. Thank you very much.